So we are now ready to create our validation component. So under the utilities, we're going to create the new directory called Validator. And inside of this Validator directory, we're going to create another class called Validator, basically the same name. And then let's give it a namespace, app, utilities, and then it's going to be Validator. There we go. Okay, so that's our validator. We're going to start with a private property called rules. By default, it's actually, let's not associate anything with it. By default, it's going to be an instance of the collection, and it's going to be Illuminate Support Collection. And let me just quickly show you where you can read a little bit more about these collections. So if you go to laravel.com, then if you click on documentation and scroll on the left hand side, you have collection. If you click this link, that's going to take you to this collections page, and you can read the introduction. The class provides a fluent, convenient wrapper for working with arrays of data. For example, check out the following code. We'll use collect help in this case, but when you're using this as a package outside of Laravel, you simply use new collection class. Then to create new collection instance from the array, and then we can obviously run anything we want from within these helper methods that are on this collection. So we've got map, for instance, which using the traditional PHP approach, you would probably use array map, but it's got plenty of these really nice methods here. You can work with the arrays in a way that you've never seen before, basically. Okay, so this is the collection. Read a little bit more if you want to. I'm going back to the editor, and we're going to continue with our validator class. Private input, and then we're going to have this as a collection as well. So collection, Illuminate Support Collection. Make sure that you obviously import this package here. So we've got Illuminate Support Collection, and then we have public errors, and that's going to be just a standard array. There we go. Okay, let's create a few new lines here, and after these errors, we're going to start with the constructor, and constructor will take rules and inputs and associate them with our properties, as we've got here. So basically it takes this collection rules and collection input and associates them with our properties. Okay, after the constructor, we are going to have the method that checks whether our request is valid. So public function is valid, and we start with if this rules is empty. And this is empty method because we're calling this rules on this collection instance. Is empty method, if we go back to the collections, let's check for is empty here. If we is empty, there we go. I'm going to open this in the new tab. What it does, basically, the is empty method returns true if the collection is empty, otherwise returns false. Pretty kind of self-explanatory if you ask me. Okay, so if there are no items within this collection, then we return true because it's going to be valid. There are obviously no items, mean there's something not right. Otherwise, this rules, and we're going to call method each on it, which is going to do something similar what for each loop would do. And then we are going to delegate the call to a specific method within our class to execute the validation, basically. And we're going to start with this within the array to indicate which class we want to use, which is ourselves, basically, this validator class, using this pseudo variable, and then what method on this class we want to use. It's going to be validate method. So each of the items within this collection, it's going to be array passed to this collection class, should go through the validation, through this validate method. And then we check return empty these errors. If errors are empty, then is valid will return true. If there are some errors within this errors array, then it's going to return false, obviously. Okay, let's add some doc blocks here. It will return Boolean, and then we're going to add some summary, validate input. Okay, so let's add this validate method. It needs to be public because we're using these methods here. In order for this method to be able, for us to be able to access these methods from within these methods, we obviously need to make them public. So public function validate, then we pass rules and key as an argument. Because with each what happens, we are going to get basically the value and the key of each item within this collection, which is basically like an array, but obviously it's an object. So it's going to pass value as the first argument and the key as the second. So now we're going to check if empty rules, because that might also happen, then we simply return nothing. In other words, we're going to go to the next iteration. And then we go for rules equals new collection. We create a new collection now, but what we're going to do is basically explode these rules, because these rules, later on you will see, we can have multiple rules per given input. We're going to explode them using the this vertical bar character, and then rules as the second argument. So basically that's going to create, say these rules stored something like required, for instance, and then email. So obviously we split them, we're using this vertical bar. So we're going to have two items within this collection, required and email. And now we're going to do the same as we did with the rules. In the first place, we're going to go use this each method on this collection. So rules, then each method, and this time we're just going to use the closure with rule as an argument, and then use statement so that we can actually pass variable into this closure. And it's going to be the key which has been passed through as an argument. And I'm going to go through all this in just a second, so we can actually have a clear understanding what's happening here. And then from within this each closure here, we're going to do this evaluate rule, and then the key as the second argument. Let me actually do this evaluate rule, and then I'm going to go through this validate, actually starting with isValid method, so everything's going to be a little bit clear. Okay, so this evaluate rule is going to be a private function. Evaluate rule, and it's going to take rule and then key. And here we're going to check parameters. First, by default, we set it to null, and then we're going to get the class name equals explode by colon and then rule. Then what we're going to do is check if count class name is more than 1, then this would indicate that we obviously had this colon and on each side there was some value. And parameters will equal class name 1. Then we're gonna go for class name equals this validator class name and index 0, and then if exclamation mark, and I'm going to inline it, new class name, and in between brackets we're gonna go for this input, then key, and then parameters, and validate method on this validate. Then this errors, we pass key, and because there might be more than one error for a given key, we're going to append another set of the square brackets, and then rule which failed. Okay, let's add this validator class, and that's going to be simply a rule rather than int. It's going to be rule, and here we're going to return namespace, because we're basically creating the name of the class with the namespace, so existing namespace, and then we add rules, and then we're going to concatenate it with a string. Basically it's a factory, which is going to be this string converter factory underscore to class name, and then rule as argument. Okay, let's go through all these methods right from the top. So is valid. First of all, we check if the rules, and imagine these rules, even though it's an instance of a class, it is going to be represented when we actually pass these rules through the constructor to this class. It's going to be something like this. Let's say name equals required, and say minimum 2 characters or something like this. Or it's an email, for instance, if it was the email field. So we have name of the input field from the form, and then what validation rules we want to associate with it. It cannot be empty when it's required, and it also has to validate, it has to have a valid email format, for instance. And all these rules would be separated by this vertical line, so you can have multiple ones per given input. So let's actually keep this here so we can reference all these items as we're going through it. So here we obviously know that there are no rules at all. So validation returns true, means everything is fine because we didn't really require anything. Any of these items that have been submitted through the form have been required. They may all be empty, for instance, so that there's no validation that needs to be done on them. Okay, so after this, we are looping through each of the items. So first, we will go, for instance, through this first item, which will be email. The key is going to be email, and then we have 2 validation rules here. So when we pass in this to this validate method here, what we get, and I'm just going to cut it so we can actually constantly see it on the screen. Okay, so here we get key is going to be this email, and then rules is going to be this string here. So required, then this pipe and email. So we check in if empty rules, which would indicate that this email didn't have anything associated, then we return without any value, which means that from here we're going to go to the next iteration within this each array. If there was another item in this array, that's what would start evaluating. Okay, but obviously normally you would, if you add anything to this this rules array, then you obviously would have something associated on the right hand side of this key. Okay, so here what we do, next we take these rules, which in our case, we are looking at this string here, these 2 items separated with this vertical line, and we exploding at them using this vertical line, creating an array. So now at this point, and this array is automatically passed through as an argument to this collection. So we're going to have another instance of the collection, so we can use all these nice methods on it. So here, basically, this explode will generate something like this, required, and then email. So what happens now, we are going through each of these items again. So first one is going to be email through the first iteration, then we go, first one is going to be required, then we're going to go through email. And to make sure that we have access to actually the key, the input name, we use this use keyword here with this closure to pass it through to each of these iterations. So what we're going to have here when we passing this, when we're running this evaluate rule, we're passing in the first instance when the first iteration goes through, we're going to have required as this rule and email as this key. So this is what's happening next. So let me just again copy all this to the next line here, and this one is what we're dealing here with as well. So I'll just put it here. Okay, so evaluate rule. We have this required as rule, email as key. Parameters by default null, then we are exploding the rule because some of these rules may have something like this. For instance, email, if we were to check exists as well on table, for instance, users, you could do something like this. At this point, we obviously would be able to divide this given rule with this column because we can check if the email exists on the table users. There are many ways we can obviously do the validations, but this is how it works. It's a very similar way that actually Laravel does it. So we are exploding this. If none of these items obviously has any column, so this count class name here would evaluate to false, so it wouldn't be more than 1 item. So parameters would only be basically the name of the rule, so it would be required. So then we overwriting this, passing the argument 0, which is going to be still required, to this validator class. So required is now passed through this validator class. So we're creating the name of the class, namespace, which is going to point to app, utilities, validator, then rules. We can actually straight away create this directory because this is where the rules are going to be stored, rule classes basically. So rules, And within this directory, we're going to have a class with the given name. So it's going to be required with a capital letter at the beginning. So it's going to be something like required.php. That's going to be the file. So obviously required class is going to represent the required rule. And this factory underscore to class, if there were any underscores, obviously sometimes these rules may have underscore as well, and say required once or something like this, then obviously that would convert this underscores and convert this type of entry to something like required once as the name of the class. But obviously that's not what we going to have here, because we only have required and email. So we pass in the rule as an argument, so this required would go as an argument, and this whole string would return something like this. This validator class would return something like this. Namespace app, then we would have utilities, then we would have validator, then we would have rules and required. That will be the full name of the class together with the namespace. That's what this method would return for this first iteration when we run through the required. For email would just be email with a capital E at the beginning, obviously with the namespace as well. Okay, so here we have the full class name, which would be this required with a namespace. And then we check exclamation mark class name, so that we instantiate in this class. We pass in the input. And input, if we scroll up, there we go. This is the input. So it's this second argument, this second collection. This goes as the first argument. Then we give the key. In our case, it would be email. And then parameters, which would either be null. At the beginning here, we associate null with this argument, with this variable. Or if we had any colon and then any values after this for a given rule, it would return a string, whatever we have after the colon. So let's just say we have required, exists, and then table users. So what would be passed through as these parameters? Obviously, in that case, we would have more than one item with this within this class name after exploding it with this colon. So this exists comma user would be passed through as the third argument here. But obviously that's not the case. We only have a single string without any colons here. So that's this parameter is definitely going to be null for this specific scenario. Obviously there might be different rules passed through to this class. Okay, so let's remove all this redundant code here, basically these examples, and let's add some doc blocks to our methods. So I'm going to start with the validate method. Validate method will have rules, which are going to be of a string type, and the key is also going to be a string. And then what is going to say? Validate input item. Validate input. Yeah, let's keep it like this. I think that makes sense. Okay, and then for the evaluate rule, we are going to have a rule against string, and then the key of the string type as well. And it's going to return anything. No, it doesn't return anything. So evaluate validation rule. And then we go into the validator class. Validator class, we are going to add a rule, which is going to be of a string type. Return string and get class name with namespace. And let's just remove these redundant lines here as well. Save the file. We can now close it because it's completed. And in the next video, we are going to create these different validation rules.